In the heart of a neglected urban landscape where streets were cracked, streetlights flickered intermittently, and opportunities were scarce, the solid wood soldiers were born. The early 1980s and 1990s had left neighborhoods battered by economic decline, a crumbling infrastructure, and the aftermath of mass incarceration policies that tore families apart. For the youth in these communities, survival was not just a necessity, it was a lesson learned daily. In this environment, groups of young men sought protection, identity, and a sense of belonging. The formation of the solid wood soldiers was not an isolated phenomenon, but a response to a larger societal failure. These streets demanded loyalty, courage, and the willingness to fight for respect. The origins of the solid wood soldiers can be traced to a few key neighborhoods, where a handful of teenagers banded together to protect themselves against older gangs and street predators. These early members were often children of broken homes, with absent fathers or mothers struggling to provide in economically devastated conditions. The name Solid Wood Soldiers reflected both the toughness they aspired to embody and a sense of permanence. Like solid wood, they wanted to be unyielding and resilient in the face of adversity. Their identity was crafted not only through survival, but through a shared culture of symbols, colors, and codes of conduct. Graffiti and tags began appearing on walls, marking territory and sending warnings to rivals. The leadership in the early days was informal, but decisive. Founding members emerged naturally, those with charisma, intelligence, or a reputation for fearlessness. Unlike hierarchical gangs that relied solely on intimidation, the solid wood soldiers valued strategy, unity, and the ability to enforce rules within their ranks. Initiation rituals began modestly, often involving acts that tested loyalty or courage, sometimes escalating to violent acts meant to establish credibility. These rituals, while extreme, served to bond members together and create a shared narrative of belonging. In a world that had offered them little, this brotherhood became their sanctuary. Community perception of the gang was complex. On one hand, local residents feared the escalating violence and the encroachment of youth gangs into public spaces. On the other hand, some viewed the soldiers as protectors, capable of shielding neighborhoods from outsiders and rival factions. The duality of fear and respect became a defining characteristic of their early existence. Many members balanced school, low-wage jobs, or family responsibilities while navigating the dangerous realities of gang life. It was a constant tension between survival, loyalty, and ambition. Societal neglect also contributed to the gang's formation. Schools were underfunded, social services were stretched thin, and job prospects were limited. For many young men, the allure of the solid wood soldiers was not just about rebellion. It was a path to recognition, influence, and material gain that conventional society had denied them. Through shared hardship, they developed strict codes of loyalty, unwritten rules about protecting each other, and a deep-seated disdain for betrayal. These early foundations would later become the backbone of the gang's operations and reputation. By the end of this formative period, the solid wood soldiers had transformed from a loosely connected group of adolescents into a structured entity with a clear sense of identity and purpose. They were small, but their presence was felt across neighborhoods. Their early conflicts with other gangs served as both training and proof of their resilience. Each street corner, each graffiti tag, and each act of defiance strengthened their reputation. The stage was now set for expansion. As the soldiers prepared to carve out territory, assert dominance, and escalate from survival to influence. As the solid wood soldiers solidified their presence in their home neighborhoods, The gang began to evolve from a small brotherhood into a more organized and influential force. The early 1990s were a period of rapid change for urban communities, with gang networks increasingly intertwining with the drug trade, street crime, and underground economies. For the soldiers, expansion was not merely about numbers. It was about establishing territory, reputation, and a foothold in the emerging landscape of street power. Their influence was measured not only by fear, but by the respect they commanded among rivals, allies, and the communities they controlled. The process of expansion was deliberate and strategic. The soldiers began to assert control over key intersections, apartment complexes, and commercial corridors that were critical for both their visibility and operations. Territory was marked with graffiti, symbols, and other public signs that signaled ownership. These territorial claims were fiercely defended, often sparking clashes with neighboring gangs that refused to recognize their authority. The soldiers quickly learned that expansion required both tactical intelligence and physical dominance. A misstep could invite retaliation, yet careful planning allowed them to grow without drawing excessive law enforcement attention in the early years. Economic influence became a defining element of their rise. The gang recognized that power was not just wielded through violence, it was also obtained through control of the underground economy. From street-level drug distribution to protection rackets, the soldiers capitalized on the vulnerabilities of their community, exploiting both the lack of opportunity and the demand for illicit services. These operations brought wealth to the gang and cemented the leadership's authority. Members who demonstrated skill in managing these enterprises were rewarded, while those who failed or betrayed trust were swiftly removed. Loyalty was currency, and trust was the foundation upon which the soldiers built their empire. The soldiers' expansion also involved recruitment and indoctrination. The gang actively sought young men who were looking for belonging, recognition, or simply a way to survive. Initiation became more formalized, with structured steps that tested loyalty, resilience, and obedience. The soldiers developed a reputation for being selective, choosing members who were not only fearless, but also strategically minded. This focus on disciplined recruitment helped the gang maintain cohesion even as they grew in size and influence. By the mid-1990s, the Solid Wood Soldiers were no longer just a neighborhood crew. They were a gang with clear leadership, a defined hierarchy, and a network of committed members prepared to defend their territory at any cost. Rivalries intensified as the soldiers' influence spread. Conflicts with other gangs became unavoidable, with territorial disputes often escalating into full-blown street wars. Early confrontations served as both initiation and propaganda, signaling to rivals that the soldiers were a force to be reckoned with. These clashes were characterized by drive-bys, armed standoffs, and strategic intimidation tactics designed to minimize their own casualties while maximizing psychological impact on opponents. The gang's ability to navigate these conflicts with a combination of violence, cunning, and negotiation further solidified their reputation in the streets. The community's perception of the soldiers was complex and often contradictory. While some residents feared the increasing violence, others saw the gang as a form of protection against outsiders and rival factions. The soldiers cultivated an image of toughness, coupled with loyalty to their neighborhoods, a narrative that allowed them to embed themselves in the local culture. Schools, local businesses, and even recreational spaces became arenas where the gang's presence was felt, whether through direct engagement or subtle displays of power. For the soldiers, influence was as much about visibility as it was about enforcement. By the end of this period of expansion, the Solid Wood Soldiers had transformed into a dominant force in their urban ecosystem. They were no longer merely a defensive brotherhood. They were active players shaping the economic, social, and criminal dynamics of their territory. Their success, however, came at a cost. Increased visibility invited scrutiny from law enforcement, intensified rivalries, and planted the seeds of internal pressure. Yet at this stage, the soldiers were confident, ambitious, and poised for even greater influence. Their rise was a testament to their strategic acumen, loyalty, and willingness to operate in the shadows and the streets alike. By the mid-1990s, the Solid Wood Soldiers had grown from a small, protective brotherhood into a dominant urban force, and with growth came inevitable conflict. Territorial disputes with rival gangs were escalating, and the streets became a stage for violent confrontation. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic clashes over power, respect, and control of the lucrative underground economy. Every block, alleyway, and corner was contested, and for the soldiers, survival meant not only defending their territory, but expanding it at any cost. The gang wars were brutal and highly organized. Rival factions had their own hierarchies, rules and codes of conduct, and the soldiers quickly learned that violence alone was insufficient to maintain dominance. Strategy became essential. Leaders orchestrated attacks, planned retaliations, and used intelligence gathered from informants and surveillance of rival activities. Drive-bys, ambushes, and targeted assaults became daily realities, each act sending a message. The soldiers would not be challenged lightly. Each confrontation was also a test of loyalty, forcing members to prove their courage and commitment under extreme pressure. One of the defining characteristics of these wars was the use of both fear and reputation as weapons. The soldiers understood that perception mattered as much as action. Tales of ruthless efficiency, willingness to retaliate, and brutal enforcement of rules spread through neighborhoods, often before the first shot was fired. This reputation acted as both a deterrent and a magnet, attracting new recruits who sought to be part of a gang that commanded respect, and warning rivals that challenging the soldiers would carry deadly consequences. For the members themselves, these wars were formative experiences, cementing bonds forged in the crucible of shared violence. These street wars also drew the attention of law enforcement, who began treating the soldiers as a major threat. Police crackdowns, increased patrols, and surveillance operations created a dual pressure on the gang. They had to defend their territory from rivals while avoiding arrests that could destabilize leadership. This tension forced the soldiers to become more sophisticated, balancing aggression with caution, and often escalating conflicts covertly to avoid attracting excessive police attention. Their ability to adapt to this dual threat was a testament to their strategic thinking and discipline. The human cost of these wars was immense. Members were killed or seriously injured in escalating reprisals, and the communities around them bore the collateral damage. Families mourned lost sons and brothers, and neighborhoods lived in constant fear. Yet the soldiers thrived in this chaos, using it as a proving ground. Each victory enhanced their prestige, while each setback forced a recalibration of strategy and loyalty. The cycle of violence created a culture where survival, respect, and fear were intertwined, and leaving the gang or betraying it was often not an option. Internal cohesion became more critical than ever during these wars. Leaders had to maintain authority, enforce discipline, and manage factions within the gang to prevent internal conflict from undermining their efforts. Members were constantly reminded of the consequences of betrayal, both through explicit punishment and symbolic acts of intimidation. This strict internal code ensured that the soldiers could operate efficiently, even under extreme pressure, and it allowed them to weather assaults from multiple rivals simultaneously. Drive-by shootings, coordinated ambushes, and street-level battles were not only about immediate gain, but also about sending a message to rivals. Media coverage, law enforcement reports, and word of mouth amplified their image, making them both feared and mythologized within the urban landscape. Each confrontation contributed to a narrative of dominance that would carry the soldiers forward, setting the stage for the challenges that lay ahead. The solid wood soldiers had established themselves as one of the most feared and respected gangs in the city. As the solid wood soldiers reached the height of their power, the external pressures of rival gangs and law enforcement were compounded by turmoil from within. By the late 1990s, the gang was no longer a small brotherhood of friends. It had grown into a complex organization with multiple factions, ambitious leaders, and competing agendas. While loyalty had once been the glue that bound the soldiers together, the strain of rapid expansion, wealth, and influence began to reveal cracks in the gang's foundation. Internal struggles emerged as one of the most dangerous threats to their survival. Leadership disputes became increasingly frequent. Founding members who had once led with authority faced challenges from younger, ambitious members who believed they could take the gang in new directions. These disputes were rarely open. Instead, they played out through subtle power plays, whispered alliances, and strategic positioning within the hierarchy. Each faction sought to control lucrative territories, drug distribution networks, and the loyalty of key members. What had once been unity through survival was giving way to competition, fueled by greed, ego, and the pursuit of dominance. Betrayal became a common, terrifying reality. Members who once pledged unwavering loyalty were tempted by prison deals, rival gang promises, or personal ambition. Snitches and defectors could destabilize entire operations overnight, and the soldiers responded with swift and often brutal enforcement of their code. Murders, beatings, and public warnings were used to maintain discipline, reinforcing the principle that internal betrayal was the greatest threat a member could commit. The very trust that had once bound the gang together was now under constant strain, creating a climate of paranoia and suspicion. The impact of incarceration was also profound. Key leaders and veteran members were arrested during routine operations or as a result of targeted law enforcement investigations. Their absence created power vacuums that younger, less experienced members were forced to fill. These gaps in leadership often led to rash decisions, poorly planned operations, and an increase in internal conflict. In many cases, the violence that once had been directed outward toward rivals now turned inward, as members vied for control and authority within the gang itself. The human toll of internal struggles was severe. Lifelong friends found themselves on opposite sides of disputes, and once close alliances fractured under the weight of ambition and mistrust. Initiation rituals that had once built loyalty became tools to enforce obedience, creating a culture of fear rather than unity. This shift in culture had long-term consequences, weakening the cohesion of the gang even as it maintained an outward image of strength. The streets may have seen a formidable and organized force, but inside, the soldiers were grappling with division, doubt, and internal instability. Despite these challenges, some members rose to the occasion. Those with tactical skill, charisma, or ruthless ambition managed to navigate the chaos and consolidate power. They reinforced discipline, reasserted control over territory, and reminded members that loyalty was non-negotiable. These leaders played a critical role in keeping the gang operational during one of the most volatile periods in its history. Yet even their efforts could not eliminate the underlying tension, and the seeds of decline were quietly being sown. By the early 2000s, the solid wood soldiers were facing threats from all sides. Rival gangs were emboldened by signs of internal weakness, and the law enforcement had begun to take the gang's presence seriously. Police operations, federal investigations, and surveillance initiatives targeted the soldiers' leaders and key members, aiming to dismantle the organization systematically. The once dominant gang now found itself under unprecedented pressure, with arrests, prosecutions, and prison sentences gradually eroding its power. Law enforcement strategies were multi-pronged. On the streets, officers increased patrols, coordinated intelligence sharing between precincts, and conducted targeted raids on known gang hotspots. These actions disrupted the gang's operations from drug distribution to protection rackets and forced the soldiers to adapt to a new level of scrutiny. At the same time, federal authorities pursued long-term investigations using informants, undercover operations, and wiretaps to build cases against top-tier members. This pressure created a climate of fear and mistrust within the gang, accelerating internal tensions and fueling paranoia. High-profile arrests had an outsized impact on the gang's stability. Leaders who had once maintained order and strategic direction were removed from the streets, leaving less experienced members to fill the vacuum. Decisions that required tactical skill or diplomacy often fell to those unprepared for leadership, leading to mistakes and conflicts that weakened the gang's cohesion. In some cases, rival gangs exploited these vulnerabilities, reclaiming lost territory and challenging soldiers' authority. The once feared gang that dominated neighborhoods began to show cracks under this combined external and internal pressure. The legal consequences were significant. Lengthy prison sentences and convictions removed influential figures from the streets, creating gaps in the gang's hierarchy. Some members turned to cooperation with authorities to reduce their own sentences, providing law enforcement with critical intelligence on operations, hierarchy, and criminal activities. This inside knowledge further destabilized the organization, making it increasingly difficult for remaining members to operate confidently or maintain loyalty. The combination of arrests, informants, and rising rival aggression set off a cascade of decline that the soldiers struggled to reverse. The psychological toll on the gang was profound. Members faced the constant threat of incarceration or death, both from law enforcement and rival factions. The fear of betrayal intensified, and the once strong bonds of loyalty were tested like never before. While the soldiers retained their reputation for toughness, the very foundation of their identity was being challenged. Leaders who had survived decades of street wars found themselves navigating a landscape where survival required not only strength and strategy, but also political acumen and legal awareness. Despite these challenges, the gang attempted to adapt. Some members tried to maintain operations underground, reducing visibility and using covert methods to continue drug distribution and territorial control. Others focused on strengthening internal discipline, attempting to rebuild loyalty and trust. Yet these efforts were often insufficient to counteract the structural damage inflicted by law enforcement pressure and internal fractures. The soldiers were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. Decline had set in, and the streets were starting to reflect it. With the solid wood soldiers' dominance waning under the combined weight of law enforcement crackdowns, rival aggression, and internal discord, the gang's story did not simply end with decline. Instead, it transitioned into a legacy, one that would leave a lasting imprint on the neighborhoods they once controlled, on the gang culture of the region, and on the individuals who had been part of it. Their rise and fall offer a complex tale of survival, ambition, and the enduring consequences of a life shaped by the streets. The streets themselves tell the story of the soldiers' influence. Graffiti tags, murals, and even the names of old hangouts and corners serve as silent markers of a once powerful presence. Former members, some of whom are still active in local criminal networks, others who have left the life behind, carry with them stories and experiences that define their identity. These narratives are often a mix of pride, regret, and reflection. Pride in their ability to survive and build influence, regret for the violence and losses endured, and reflection on what might have been if circumstances had been different. The soldiers' cultural impact extends beyond mere memory. Local youth, communities, and rival gangs learned lessons from both the gang's rise and its decline. For some, the soldiers became an example of strength, brotherhood, and strategic thinking, skills that were adapted into newer forms of street organization. For others, they became a cautionary tale of what happens when loyalty is tested, ambition goes unchecked, and law enforcement pressure exposes vulnerabilities. The Solid Woods Soldiers' story continues to inform urban gang dynamics decades after their peak, influencing recruitment, territorial disputes, and organizational strategies among contemporary crews. Former members have followed varied paths after the gang's decline. Some entered prison systems for extended sentences, where they were forced to navigate new hierarchies and challenges. Others attempted to reintegrate into their communities, sometimes acting as mentors, mediators, or advocates against gang violence. In certain neighborhoods, a surprising number of ex-members have used their knowledge of the streets to guide younger generations away from crime, channeling experience into education, employment programs, or community activism. Yet for many, the pull of loyalty and old alliances remains strong, reflecting the difficulty of severing ties to a life that defined their formative years. Law enforcement and sociologists alike have studied the soldiers' legacy, analyzing how environmental factors, internal cohesion, and structural vulnerabilities contributed to their rise and fall. These studies underscore the broader social implications of urban gang activity, highlighting how systemic neglect, economic disparity, and lack of opportunity can create conditions that give rise to groups like the Solid Woods Soldiers. Their story is thus both unique and representative, a microcosm of the broader struggle between marginalized communities, crime, and social structures. The soldiers' legacy is also deeply personal. Families who lost sons, brothers, and fathers continue to grapple with the consequences of violence and incarceration. Communities once terrorized by the gang are still shaped by the memory of their presence, both in physical scars left on neighborhoods and in the psychological impact on residents. Yet even in decline, the gang's narrative is imbued with a sense of resilience and survival, reflecting the duality of street life, destruction and loyalty, fear and respect, chaos and structure. The story of the Solid Woods Soldiers emerges as a powerful reflection on human behavior under extreme conditions. Their rise, their street wars, internal struggles, and eventual decline all highlight lessons about loyalty, ambition, consequence, and adaptation. While the gang no longer commands the streets as it once did, its influence endures in culture, in cautionary tales, and in the lives of those who carry its history forward. The legacy of the Solid Woods Soldiers reminds us that the streets remember, and the story of power, survival, and brotherhood continues to resonate long after the last graffiti tag fades from the walls.